Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. The program is about to begin. At this time, please turn off all electronic devices. Please refrain from using flash photography during the program. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome former Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper.
Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Reagan Library. I'm Roger Zackheim, Director of the Ronald Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C. We had our grand opening this past June, so we're ready for all of you to visit during your next trip to Washington, D.C. So please come and say hello. But we are very thrilled to have all of you here joining us tonight. But as we do at the Reagan Library, before we begin, please join me in honoring the men and women who defend our freedom by standing and reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Be seated, please. Before we get started, there's one person in the audience I'd like to recognize this evening. Secretary Esper's wife, Leah. Thank you so much for being here this evening. In May of 1981, during the first commencement season of his presidency, Ronald Reagan addressed the graduates of West Point with these words, quote, "The indispensable factor for protection for all that we hold dear is leadership," he said. Quote, "The leadership that you offer to this nation. You will be the individuals who most inspire and lead those who called upon to do the hard and sometimes thankless job," end quote. 5 years later, one such leader emerged from West Point in the class of 1986. And just as President Reagan predicted, he would go on to inspire and lead those doing, quote, "the hard and sometimes thankless job." Indeed, Mark Esper's own career would be one of challenging and, yes, sometimes thankless work. Serving in the 101st Airborne Division, flying with the Screaming Eagles during the Gulf War, commanding an airborne rifle company in Europe, serving another 11 years in the National Guard and Army Reserve. And after leaving active duty, he worked for a great number of conservative leaders and institutions, many of whom can trace their political lineage to Ronald Reagan and his revolution. He's also helped lead top congressional committees and government agencies and the aerospace defense companies. Now, after serving as Secretary of Army from 2017 to 2019, he was elevated to Secretary of Defense at what would become a precarious time for the nation. Here's the list. Conflict with Iran, an ongoing military campaign in Afghanistan, counterterrorism operations in the Middle East, open competition with Russia and China, the greatest civil unrest and political turmoil America has seen in decades, a major recession, and the spread of a global pandemic. That's quite a list. It makes anyone anxious just reading it. Now, he recounts it all in his candid and at times unsettling memoir, A Sacred Oath. And we're honored that he has chosen to share his experiences along with his lessons and warnings with the Reagan Library audience tonight. Back in that spring day in 1981, when President Reagan concluded his remarks at West Point, after invoking Douglas MacArthur, he exhorted the graduates to, quote, "Do your duty, keep untarnished your honor, and you of the Corps will preserve this country," end quote. In his career thus far, I think it's fair to say that Mark Esper has more than done his duty. He has proven himself to be a man of honor. and in upholding his sacred oath, he has helped preserve this country. The jobs may indeed have seemed thankless at times, Dr. Esper, but tonight, as we welcome you to the Reagan stage, I hope everyone will join me in saying thank you for your service. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the 27th U.S. Secretary of Defense, Dr. Mark Esper. Well, Secretary Esper, welcome back to the Reagan Library.
Well, thank you. With such a kind and generous introduction, I should make you my campaign manager.
All right, sign me up. I'm good. All right. Well, there's a lot to discuss tonight, and you've been to this library on a number of occasions because of our Reagan National Defense Forum. I believe you hold the world record for attending every single one of those defense forums. So we're grateful for that and for you being here tonight. But of course, tonight's about a sacred oath. Figured we'd start with a very basic question. Why did you write this book?
Oh, why did I write this book? I wrote the book because I thought that the Trump administration, particularly the last year of the Trump administration, which is the principal time in which I served, is a very, very consequential time in American history. And that it was very important for us to understand what happened, why things happened, and to learn lessons from that time. So as we march forward, we can apply those lessons and make sure we don't make the same mistakes, if you will. It's very important that the American people know their history and that we learn from that history. And I think it's important that me and many, many others write and contribute to this narrative, to understanding that a very important piece of our rich history and what it means, particularly as we look ahead.
So we'll get to some of the key moments during your tenure as Secretary of Defense and the policies you're involved in. And I mean, there's so much there. I went through a list of challenges that are daunting. But just to stick with
we had the
why.
Killer Hornets, too, remember?
Say again?
The Killer Hornets.
The Killer, right, that didn't make the cut. But you're right, we have that, too. But the title of your book's interesting. It doesn't mention the Trump administration by name. You focus on the oath. Why is that the lens through which you think about your time serving as Secretary of Defense during the Trump administration? It really bookends the book itself in terms of focusing on the oath.
So it's a great follow-on to your first question because I told you why I wrote the book, but I wrote the book for multiple audiences. The first being the American people and our history, but also for current and future practitioners of government, for students of government, and also for people who serve in the military. And for me, my professional life began at age 18 when I went into West Point and was ingrained from day one with duty, honor, country. And I swore that first oath on the plane at West Point, July 1st, 1982, and raised my right hand and swore an oath to the country. And I believe in oaths. I've only taken two, and they're very important, and one was to the country and one was to my wife. and I don't violate either. And so that has framed my service to country in so many ways, whether it was active duty military, whether it was serving on Capitol Hill, or during my 5 stints at the Pentagon, that when times got tough, I would come back to what is my oath, what is my duty, and to whom is my duty? And my duty was to the country, not to a president, not to a party, not to a philosophy, but to the country. And that is what grounded me. And thank goodness I had my 4 years at West Point and my many years in the service to reinforce those values and those time-honored traditions. So for me, that's kind of what that standard, that principle, it became the lens through which I wanted to kind of focus everything.
So I want to pursue this a bit because there's actually a second facet to when you become a Secretary of Defense or anybody in the President's cabinet. On the one hand, you have the oath and duty to country, but you're not elected by the American people.
Right.
Right? You are serving at the pleasure of the President of the United States. You are an appointee of that administration. You're grinning. We've talked about this perhaps before, but I want you to kind of unpack this a little bit for everybody in the room. Right? The tension, of course, is when you're forced to choose between the oath and the individual, in this case President Trump, that you are serving, serving at his pleasure. Talk a little bit about that tension, and I mean, the book really goes into quite substantial detail of where you felt that tension.
Yeah, look, it's a very sophisticated look in some ways in terms of civil military relations and what your oath is as an American serving your country. And it's important. This is a reason why I wrote the book, because I hope folks in the future don't have to confront situations that I face. But here's the dilemma. If your oath is to the Constitution, which my oath is, I've taken it a dozen times, you got to keep in mind that Article 1 of the Constitution says, Article 2 of the Constitution says that we have a president who is also the commander-in-chief, and you are bound to obey the orders of the commander-in-chief. And that is where the tension can really become acute. And thank goodness President Trump rarely gave direct orders. And so I was never faced with the situation of disobeying a direct order because I had sufficient room to kind of decide on my own what was best, given, again, my oath, but the general guidance of where the administration wanted to go. So it was how I sorted and reasoned my way through my tenure to do what I felt was best for the country, for our service members, for the institution.
We're going to dig at this a little bit more, but you said something curious in the response about this potential tension between the oath, the Constitution, and then serving at the pleasure of the President of the United States. And that is, President Trump never gave you a direct order, at least gave you a direct order which would create a tension between the Constitution. What would be an example of something he cared deeply about? I know there's a few, that maybe more than a few that come up, but it was really not left, the president wasn't actually boxing you in a corner. It was kind of out there for you to interpret, or advisors would come through and kind of encourage you to take a certain course of action that you were able to fend off because perhaps it wasn't in the best interest, in your judgment, for the military of the country.
So the most important one was, and I talk about it in the book, I have a chapter on this, was the president's order to withdraw U.S. forces from Germany. And of course, I get this order within a week, within 5 days of what happened on June 1st. So the timing is not good in terms of my relationship with the president. So I almost get fired, and then I get this order to withdraw 10,000 troops from Germany. And the president's intent was to bring them back home and to kind of, it was punitive towards Germany, if you will, for a number of things. And we can talk about
he wasn't a big fan of the Germans.
He wasn't, but this is where I try to be fair here, because President Trump was absolutely right about the Germans and their failure to cut off Nord Stream 2 to the Russians and their policy toward the Russians, and all this is playing out. He was spot on. But the way to go about it wasn't to pull 10,000 troops out of Germany and undermine NATO and undermine our ally at the same point. That's counterproductive to what you're trying to do when you're trying to deter the Russians and get the Germans on board. But there was sufficient room in his order for me to kind of interpret that. And as I had done with bosses throughout my professional lifetime, I always felt it was my responsibility to understand what they wanted to do and then come back and bring a variety of options that I thought were either more efficient or more effective at achieving them and present those. And that's exactly what I did. I went back and spoke to my commanders. It was maybe one of the first times where I thought, I may have to resign over this one, because if I have to really execute it a certain way, then it would really hurt our strategic place, our strategic situation, and undermine the alliance. And I had, by that time, had begun roughing out my 4 no's, and one of them was no strategic retreats. And so a withdrawal from Germany in a way that could undermine NATO would, in my mind, be a strategic retreat.
So I want to get back to June 1st and the 4 no's. We'll get there. That's kind of the really meaty and headline-grabbing component of your book. But let's stick with this Germany example for a moment, because it also gets marked to the craft of being a Secretary of Defense and a leader in the cabinet. I mean, you were really weighing 2 things, as I read it and have discussed with you. President of the United States really didn't like the Germans, felt they were taking advantage, felt they were free riders, which, by the way, many Americans feel that way, and perhaps you share some of those views as well. At the same time, President of the United States really didn't want to get into war. That was a clear view of President Trump. We're not going to get into another war.
Right.
And I mean, you could take those 2 variables and say, well, the 10,000 troops risk what? I mean, potentially creating a vacuum.
You risk creating a vacuum, undermining the alliance, the unity of the NATO alliance. And look, I felt that I brought a lot to this issue. I served in Europe for 3 years. Right? I was stationed there, so I participated in NATO. I understood NATO. I worked NATO issues on Capitol Hill. I understood the alliance and its importance in our history. look, this foundation built by Ronald Reagan and how he invigorated the alliance when he stood at the Berlin Wall. Remember that? And so it was very, very important. And again, I knew that I thought I could figure out a way to really square this in a way that actually could improve things. And we actually, at the end of the day, came up with a way to move troops out of Germany, but reposition them in a way that not just consolidated units, Army units and Air Force to make them more effective, but pushed them further east toward the Russians, and which would call for more NATO troops, more U.S. troops in Romania, in Bulgaria, and I was pushing for the Baltics as well. Now, think how nice that would have been if we had actually followed through on that plan.
Right.
And we had them there.
You would have made President Trump happy and Vladimir Putin unhappy. Pretty good day.
And I would have made, right, and I think the current administration would be happy that we would have troops there right now when Putin invaded Ukraine on February 24th. So.
And in that respect, President Trump was really prescient, right? The Germans were taking Nord Stream 2 and obviously not cooperating on that front, benefiting from it. And then now, of course, Vladimir Putin has turned off Nord Stream 1 in terms of, and they're feeling the pain for being reliant on Russia for their energy. Let's go back to June 1st, 2020. And so the context here for everybody, and I'm sure all in the audience recall, you had George Floyd murdered, you have protests in cities across the country turned violent. There was a real concern that we had lost control in our cities. President Trump wants it to stop. And he wants to do everything in his power to go ahead and get control of cities where we have lost law and order. Mm-hmm. And then your phone rings. So
keep in mind, in Washington, D.C. became the epicenter, at least for a few days, for the protests. And we had fires burning, vandalism in D.C., we had Secret Service injured. We had National Guardsmen injured. So there were violent protests. It wasn't widespread, but there was enough going on that the next morning, Monday morning, June 1st, General Milley and I get called to the White House.
General Milley is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of
Staff. Right. He is the principal advisor, no more, no less, to the president and to myself on military matters. So he goes with me. And he and I and Attorney General Bill Barr are there, along with the Vice President and others in the room. And the President is quite enraged. He's up and down out of his chair, waving his arms, that this is happening in the streets of America, particularly in D.C. His view was it made us look weak. The country looked weak, made him look weak, and it needed to end. We wanted to stop it. And what he wanted to do was to bring 10,000 troops into the nation's capital to suppress the protests, to get it all under control. And that kind of further sets the scene, if you will, with the 3 or 4 of us sitting in front of the desk and this unfolding. And, Bill Barr and I didn't have a chance to talk beforehand, but he was on my side in terms of saying, look, this is a law enforcement action. DOD can support, if need be, law enforcement. And if we do, we should do it through the National Guard, through the D.C. National Guard. Again, this is where I kind of brought more experience to this. I'd worked these issues in the past as an officer at DOD, and I was a National Guard officer in the D.C. National Guard. So I knew what the D.C. National Guard could and could not do and all that. But at that point in time, when the president's pushing for active duty troops, paratroopers, by the way, to come into the city, Bill Barr and I are standing firm, pushing back, saying this is law enforcement. Milley is helpful as well. He's citing the statistics of what's happening in that city. And the conversation gets really, really rough. And it's at the point in time when the president is calling us, using some foul terms, losers, and turns to the vice president and makes the same comment at him in his direction, that I realized we are at a different level. And we were fortunate enough to kind of walk him back from that. I kind of proposed a move where I would move some active duty forces far south of D.C., nowhere near, but it was enough to get him off the issue. Bill Barr came in and said he'll bring in 5,000 law enforcement. I promised to bring up the Guard, and we got out of the room. The key in the Trump White House was once you got your answer, get out of the room immediately. Because
yes for an answer.
Because somebody from the back would want to appeal the decision, and so that was the key: is get out, get your decision, get out.
So let's just explore this a little bit more. I'm making you revisit trauma, but it's in your book, so I guess it's fair game. I don't understand why this was such a big deal. Like, why was President Trump so focused on active duty paratroopers coming in as opposed to having 5,000 plus National Guards men and women in the street? I mean, if anything, right, and you're expert in this, the National Guard is better trained, has more knowledge of how to interact with civilians, this type of scenario. Where did the president get this idea from that it had to be active duty? It seems so curious to me that he would have such a strong view on this one particular, and it became obviously.
And I don't know.
You don't know, okay.
This is where experience helps in these situations. I told you I was in the D.C. National Guard. I also commanded paratroopers. So, I mean, our paratroopers are shock troops. And I don't know who put the idea of the 82nd Airborne. I don't know who put the number 10,000 in his head, but that was what came out. And I knew that would be bad. It would be bad for a number of things, right? First of all, it was too much force, right? It's a law enforcement mission, number one. Number two is to introduce active duty troops into the nation's capital would just be terrible for the country, terrible for the American people, terrible for the institution of DOD, terrible for the military, terrible for the relationship between the American people and their soldiers and their service members. There was nothing good about it, right? I mean, I was a young boy when Kent State happened. I don't remember the event, but I remember the aftermath of it and the fallout and the killing of, we didn't want anything like that to happen. So you could connect the historical dots to understand this was all really bad. Because once you put combat troops in the streets of a city, you're introducing an element you can't control. And so for all those reasons, it just didn't make sense. And again, fortunately, I was supported by Bill Barr, and General Milley, of course, was supportive. And we were able to walk him back, which would have been a very bad decision for this country. Look, it took us, many of you know, it took us decades to recover from what happened during the 70s, the relationship between the U.S. military and the American people from Vietnam and from cases like Kent State and all that. We didn't want to go through that. We had the best military in the world, thanks to Ronald Reagan and others. The best military, the most professional military in the world. And as strong and brave and professional as those troops are, it is a fragile thing. And you have to preserve it. And moments like that in history can really take an institution and tear it apart.
I take your point, but in the end of the day, there are troops who are trained to do this type of mission.
Called the National Guard.
And I think most Americans wouldn't distinguish between the two.
And that is. Most people
You can show force, right, but obviously you have more confidence that they're, you wouldn't take a guardsman, maybe put them in the middle of a counterterrorism operation, right? It's just about getting the right troop for the
It's the right tool for the right mission. Most people don't. They see uniform. They don't make the distinction between active, Guard, and reserve. Those are three distinct components, if you will, with different authorities and different capabilities. And a lot of presidents, a lot of people who work in the White House don't understand those differences. That's why it's the duty of the Secretary of Defense and the chairman to explain those differences and to make the recommendations best for the situation.
But that wasn't the end of the story, right? And the saga goes on.
It's a long story. You can buy it.
Yeah, right. Well, we'll highlight just a little bit more of it, because in the end of the day, and it wasn't just President Trump who was talking about troops, in our cities, but also you have the left and the media sensationalizing it as well, and became this great showdown. And President Trump wanted to demonstrate that he was in control and had restored order in our cities, and particularly Washington, D.C. That led to the events in the Oval. And
we did have a lot of unlawful behavior happening in American cities, right? Americans have the right to protest and absolutely should. It's a First Amendment right, but you should do so peacefully. We had things happening in cities where, buildings were being burned, police stations were being burned, people were being hurt. Americans who run small businesses were seeing their stores, their livelihoods being destroyed. Look, we can't tolerate that. But that doesn't mean you call them the 82nd Airborne, right? I'm a law enforcement Reagan Republican, so I think you should have law and order. But there are ways to do it and ways not to do it.
So these events ultimately got you, I guess you would diplomatically call, hot water with the President of the United States.
Boiling water.
Yeah, boiling water. There we go. And it came down to another kind of esoteric law that the president wanted to exercise. Again, I don't know where President Trump, got this from. Apparently, it wasn't clear to others, where he wanted to authorize, you make use of the Insurrection Act.
Right.
And you came out strongly against that, much to the chagrin of the commander-in-chief who you work for. Just tell us a little bit about what that is, what that was, obviously relates to what you're talking about, but ultimately it really changed the nature of your time as Secretary of Defense, because after that you develop your 4 no's.
Yeah. So the Insurrection Act is a 19th century law that basically allows the commander-in-chief in certain situations to deploy either active duty forces into a city like, well, into any American city, or to use the Guard in other cities if they're not under state control. So in this case, we recall the nights of June 1st, that is Lafayette Park. You have eventually protests are breaking out. I think the count I have in my book is 300 cities across the United States. And as I write in my memoir, it just felt like the country was wobbly, that we were off our mark, that we could have tipped over into some anarchy, may be too strong a word, but things were going haywire. And it was because the president kept talking about invoking the Insurrection Act, kept coming up discussions about the active duty, the military, and how do we suppress this type of stuff.
And he's concerned because governors are not calling for this in states where this is
not
happening.
Taking action themselves.
Correct. Right. They're sitting on their hands.
Which is another issue. So, I get the Monday runs to Tuesday, and by Tuesday night, I'm really troubled by what I see. As I look at every TV station, you see pictures of cities burning and people protesting, and it just feels really out of control. And so I decided that night, and I usually go to bed early, 10 p.m. or so, and I stay up late and write what would largely become my speech before the media the next day at the Pentagon podium, where I talk about the tragic murder of George Floyd, but unfortunately this was not a new thing in America, but we had risen to this point. I talked about the relationship between the American people and the United States military, the importance of civil-military relations, the importance of being an apolitical military, and then the part that gets me in trouble, which I knew it would, it was fine, but I talk about how there are times to use the active duty military and when it's urgent and dire and stuff like that, and I said that this was not one of those moments, that I did not support an invocation of the Insurrection Act, and I did it specifically, that I wanted that sentence to stand out the way it did, because what I was hoping to do was to just put a hand on the wheel to kind of stop the Republic from wobbling, to settle things down, to say I was not going to be part and parcel of this, that I did not support that, and that was the recommendation, of course, I made to the president privately, but I wanted to publicly say that. And got me in a lot of hot water, but I had to go walk over to the White House for another tense meeting. But things started settling down. And I felt that we achieved our goal, that by Wednesday afternoon, you could see things settling down. I kind of took the initiative to start withdrawing troops without White House permission, because I felt they were no longer needed. So we started pulling back active duty. We started pulling back.
As a matter of law, you don't need White House permission to pull out.
No, I don't. Look, I'm hired to make decisions. If I need to go to the White House for everything, then you don't need me. You don't need a Secretary of Defense. So it was within my responsibility. So we did that consciously, because what we wanted to signal was not just what I had said rhetorically, but we wanted to show it through action. We wanted to show that troops were being withdrawn, that the situation was calming down, and send that message that way. And it worked. Things started calming down by Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. We kind of really, you saw all the temperature die down, and things settled down. So
things settle down in the cities in our country, but they're kind of firing up within the Oval Office. And so you have another encounter with the president. He makes it clear he's unhappy with what you've done. It's a remarkable moment, actually, in the book, because you go from this very tense meeting, president's unhappy with what you said, you show him what you actually said, and then it kind of stops, and then you have to pivot to a very consequential national security meeting about Afghanistan, which leads to the president talking about he wants to take an operation against Iran. And for the life of me, how do you go from the President of the United States coming at you, and then 15 minutes later you're advising the President of the United States about what our policy should be vis-a-vis Iran and whether we should consider a strike against that country? Did I get the scenario right?
It's a very tense meeting with the president where he and I, he's yelling at me, screaming at me, and making allegations, and I'm kind of countering him and saying, no, that's not what happened. And we get to the point where, anticipating that he would do something, I had prepared brought a draft of my remarks, and I set them on the table and slapped them down and slid them over and said, that's what I said.
Right.
And it kind of, the argument ended right there. And you're right, somebody came into the room and said, Mr. President, your 12 o'clock or whatever meeting is here with General McKenzie to talk Afghanistan.
He's a central commander
he's
responsible for that whole area.
Commander, right? And I figured I was going to get fired right there that afternoon. And of course, as we walked to the Situation Room, I'm debating, should I just resign? And, get it over with. And I go back to what's my duty, right? It would have been easy for me to resign. It would have been easy for me, and Leah will tell you, it would have been so much heartache saved and everything. But I decided I had a duty, and it also kind of shaped my thinking as I go into the Situation Room to talk to the president about Afghanistan, which is a very consequential issue, right? 20 years at war. It's where the place from which the terrorists killed 3,000 innocent people, Americans, in New York City and Shanksville, PA, and the Pentagon. And I decided I'm just going to act as if, in some ways, nothing happened. I'm going to do my job. And so we get in there, and I open up the policy pitch as if, and Millie turns it over, and then eventually McKenzie. But we brief the president on Afghanistan and what's happening and the plans. And of course, it migrates into discussing should we or should we not attack Iran, because there are other people in the room kind of cheerleading the president on to do these.
Keep on talking about these other people in the room, the people in the back and then the other people in the room.
This is kind of the mystery with the Trump White House was you never knew who he was talking to, either within the White House or people would call in or he'd call people, so you never knew who was putting ideas in his head. But in this case, it was a national security advisor who was proposing we attack Iran, we go after them, let's finish this. And Millie and I both pushing back, saying that just doesn't make any sense. So look, I'm no fan of Iran, and we should not allow them to get a nuclear weapon, but we weren't at that situation where it wasn't the point in time to make that decision. And you have to prepare for those things. You have to prepare the country. You have to, prepare the military.
No, I was going to say it's a good example of where you were effective at reasoning in a way that appealed to President Trump's other primary concern.
President Trump could be quite unpredictable in many things, and most things, but he was clear on one thing. He did not want to go to war. He was very clear about that. Now, the danger was people would say, if you do this, don't worry, they won't go to war. It'll be clean and easy, and don't worry. And that's a very dangerous thing, right? It's easy to get into wars. I fought in the Gulf War, right? But it's hard to get out of them. And I've been saying recently, I bet you Vladimir Putin 7-8 months ago had a chance to ask his generals again, is this going to be quick and easy, guys?
In Ukraine, yeah.
He might have made a different decision. And that's what you don't know. So if you're going to start a war, you better not just consider what the best outcome, you better consider the worst outcome and prepare for the worst. And we weren't ready for that. And that was my view and remains my view, that's how you have to approach these situations, because you never know where it'll go. And look, these are our boys and girls, our young men and women who are sitting in harm's way. And you just don't, flippantly go after and do something like that. You have to, these are consequential decisions. It can shape the arc of history in certain people's lives. I was in that situation as a young infantry officer with the 101st. So you take those things into great, great care. But that was one of the challenges, was who was whispering in his ear about this or that.
So didn't get fired.
Didn't get fired.
Stayed the course in Afghanistan and prevented an attack on Iran.
Importantly, continue to recommend, because I would do it at every meeting, and others would, that if we're going to continue to withdraw from Afghanistan, there are going to be a point in time where we should stop until the Taliban live up to their end of the agreement. And of course, this was June, and I could see where this was going. Of course, by October, I have to end up sending a classified memo to the president saying we should not go below 4,500.
Well, I'm going to get to Afghanistan in a little bit, but obviously the Biden administration did not read your memo, because the debacle that followed during the Biden administration clearly did exactly what you warned against. All right, so you have these intense meetings in June. To your surprise, you're still Secretary of Defense, and you develop this construct of the four no's, and kind of it would guide you in your service as Secretary from this period in June until just after the midterm, the elections, presidential elections in November of 2020.
Right. So, yes, the four no's come out of, after June, the events of June 1st, not just the morning, but the afternoon, where Millie and I make the mistake of getting caught up in the photo op walk across Lafayette Park. We realize that we have to I have to calibrate my political antennae better so that I don't put myself or the institution in a situation where we look like we're being political. Now, I'm on one hand, it's different for me, right? If you're a uniform officer, the lines are very clear. But for me, for a political appointee, you have 1 foot in the apolitical camp and 1 foot in the political camp. So it's a little bit different. But nonetheless, for the institution, I had to be far more calibrated. And I come up with the 4 no's, Millie and I. And by the way, the 4 no's are not just what comes out of June 1st. There are events leading up to this from 6 months prior, going back to January. And I talk about in the book the proposal to send 250,000 troops to the border, the idea to shoot missiles into Mexico to take out the drug labs, things like that. The 4 no's end up being no politicization.
Perhaps we shouldn't gloss over those last 2 recommendations. Would you mind repeating them one more time, some of the other ideas that perhaps you didn't want to get behind? Talk about the missiles into Mexico. That one caught my attention.
Well, they're kind of related. Stephen Miller proposes to me in an Oval Office meeting.
And he's the advisor inside the White House on immigration.
That we send 250,000 troops to the border to stop the caravans that are coming north. And I thought he was joking. And as I write in the book, he was not joking. He was dead serious. And plans had already begun through the Department of Homeland Security. And I write about this in the book. I go back to the Pentagon a day or so later. Millie's in my office and my chief of staff. And I say, Stephen Miller mentioned this idea about putting 250,000 troops to the border. I said, I just need to be careful because goofy things happen. This is where experience teaches you that goofy things happen, and you just got to check. I said, check with Northern Command. Make sure they're not doing anything goofy.
And Northern Command is the command responsible for the kind of military around the border of North America.
Yeah, right, for the border, for floods and hurricanes and all that stuff. So Millie comes back days later, and he's waving a piece of paper, and in that voice, Secretary, you're not going to believe this. And I'm thinking, well, what am I not going to believe now? Because I've lived a lot here lately. And he says, here are the plans. Northern Command, Northcom, was working on plans with DHS to send 250,000 troops to the border.
How does that happen? You're the Secretary of Defense. You're the only one in the chain of command. Were you able to figure out how Northern Command got the order? From who?
There's things happening all the time in an institution of 2.8 million people, the largest in the United States government, maybe the largest in the world, second to the People's Liberation Army. So people are doing great stuff all the time, but sometimes folks, their political antennae isn't calibrated either. And yes, I write how I was disappointed that nobody thought to kind of raise that flag up and say, hey, are you guys, Millie, Esper, are you guys aware that this is going on? But we had to find out the hard way. And I was able to put an end to it. Now, this is important because it affects, you made an important point that affects my decision-making why to stay in office, because there are only 2 positions in the entire United States government that can deploy U.S. military troops, the President and the Secretary of Defense, right? And the President wasn't going to do it. So it came down to this singularly important position. I could send troops out, I could bring troops back, I could decide not to send troops, I could decide to send troops. But only my pen could do that. Only my signature could do that. So it was a very powerful tool. And so when that order came up, I said, tell them to stop immediately. And I said, if anybody has any complaints, whether in my building or DHS or the White House, tell them to call me. And I'll tell them why we're not going to do that. And I never heard a peep.
Okay, stupid question. Why is it a bad idea? Because the border's an issue. You would concede the point there. I mean, we're seeing it right now.
Oh, yeah, it's terrible.
250,000 troops on the border. Why is that a bad idea?
Well, we don't have 250,000 troops to begin, right? Believe it or not, to muster 250,000 troops would be every single unit in the United States Army. We'd have to pull them back from Korea and Germany and everywhere else. And even then, I'm not sure. It's ridiculous. You don't need 250,000 troops to deal with, the people coming across the border. First of all, it's a DHS mission, a Homeland Security mission. It's not a military mission. Now, that said, Republican and Democratic administrations for years, and
troops on the border.
Yeah, we've always had troops supporting DHS on the border. So that's not a new thing. I had no issues with a few thousand troops providing support, but 250,000 troops, we hadn't deployed that many since Gulf War, because we didn't deploy that many to Afghanistan. So it was just ridiculous. And then to do what, right? To stand shoulder to shoulder with M16s and what are we? It's just
human wall.
It's absurd. So that was one event. And then the second one was President Trump wanted to shoot Mexico's missiles into Mexico to knock out the drug labs. And this is where I write in the book. Again, I try and be fair to folks. The president was sincere about drugs in American cities and communities. We've all seen it, right? We've all seen the ravages of drugs, and I get where he was going. Like, if you could knock these guys out, why not do it? And try and cut the flow of fentanyl or opioids or whatever's coming up from Latin America. But that's not the way you do it. And so on one hand, I was sympathetic, but I had to talk him out of this and say that's not the way to do it. You know, it would be against the law. It's an act of war to shoot missiles into another country. There are better ways to do that. We should go revisit our cooperation programs. You know, I had traveled in the past, for example, to South America on congressional delegations. I had a little bit of knowledge about our programs. So, but it was another way where I could kind of talk him out of that, what I thought would have been a really bad decision for him. But his heart was in the right place in terms of trying to stop the flow of drugs into American cities.
Great. So we have 4 no's. Sounds like we got good
four
examples of no misuse of the military.
No misuse
right?
of the military, no unnecessary wars, no politicization of DOD, and no strategic retreats. So Germany would have been a strategic retreat. Troops in the cities of America would have been misuse of the military, and there's some other stuff, but yes.
What would be your primary example of where you felt you got closest to unnecessary war?
Iran, attacking Iran, or maybe military operations against Venezuela, which also would come up frequently, is what could we do about Venezuela?
No politicization of the military. Mm-hmm. Why was that top of mind? Certainly you were talking about the picture in front of St. John's Church. That would be an example. But what else was going on and were you thinking about post-June 2020 leading up to the election that was a primary concern for you, politicization of the military? So
it goes back to the events of June 1st. So as I write in the book, I kind of weigh this out. Should I stay or should I go? What should I do? What's my duty? I knew what my duty was, but can I hang in there? And I came to the conclusion after, by the way, consulting, Leah, I famously has this phrase. She says, as your wife, I want you to quit, but as an American citizen, please stay. And that becomes very compelling to me, right? And it kind of summed up what I felt. And she was closest to me, so she's going through all this drama with me, the hard days and long nights. And then I consult others, former predecessors from both parties, Colin Powell, who had become a mentor of mine. And to a person, they say, stay. And so I decided to stay. And my thing is stick to the 4 no's. So I have a metric, I have a strategy, and then the thing is, what's the timeline? And my timeline became very clear. I got to get to the election. Let the American people decide what they want for the next 4 years, Biden or Trump. And but as we head up to the election and go through the election, I do not want American troops getting involved in American politics or the electoral system and all that stuff. So that became kind of my goal. If I can get to the election, just get to the election without crossing any of these red lines, I feel I will have been successful. And I knew at that point in time, Trump was going to fire me immediately because I was expendable then.
Meaning after the election, there was no liability for firing.
Right, because the big concern among his campaign folks was if he were to fire a SecDef 6 months before the election, it would call into question his leadership, and would there be lack of confidence from folks, and would it hurt his campaign re-election? So I knew I had that much time.
But it still was hard to navigate, because I know one of the things you write about and we've discussed was a big part, and in some ways it explains your emphasis on telling the story and writing this book, is you want to be transparent and talk to the American people. But you kind of had to hem that in a little bit, right? After those events in June leading up to the election.
Yeah, so there's we and I were talking beforehand, if I have a common critique that comes from the left, which is, why didn't you tell us at the time, right? Why didn't you just come out and tell us? And I would say, because I'd be fired immediately, right? What am I going to come out on national TV and say, Stephen Miller wants to send 250,000 troops to the border, or the president wants to shoot missiles into Mexico? I'd be fired immediately. Right. And by the way, I should be fired immediately. That's what I would do if I were the president. But my logic was, look, if I can continue to stop these bad things from happening, particularly given the fact that I have this position, I have this power of the pen where I can deploy or not deploy troops, then you don't give that up easily, particularly when you know the president is going to put a true loyalist in behind you. Because I had seen him do that when he fired the DNI, and he put in Rick Grinnell as his acting DNI, and I saw the mayhem that had caused, and he had been talking about doing that with others. So I knew that if I relinquished that position, that there was a greater chance that these bad things would happen.
Your successor would not have followed the four no's.
I don't know. I don't believe so. It's not apparent from what happened because within days of me leaving, there's a meeting on attacking Iran. We withdraw American troops from Africa. We do a number of other things. So my thing was I did not want to relinquish the position knowing what could happen because I thought that I would actually feel more guilty if I had done that I was not doing my duty knowing what could happen and the position that the American military, that the country, et cetera, would be placed in. And that's why I didn't resign. That's why I didn't come out and speak out at the time. I felt it'd be better to kind of work my magic within the system and kind of keep the ship as steady as I can. I thought that was my higher duty to the country. And some people don't understand that. They don't get it. That's fine. But that's how I felt. And I'm more convinced that was the right decision today than ever before. At the time, not so much so.
Well, I was certainly balancing the oath against the roles was a tension you managed, and yeah, things got pretty heated in those days after you left the Department of Defense, leading up to the inauguration, the events of January 6th and inauguration. A few minutes, we'll go to questions from the audience. So get your questions ready, but I got to ask you a few current events questions. They're touched on in the book, but would love for you to comment on kind of how you see them now, since you've published your book. Let's talk about trust and confidence in the military. You have a narrative on the left saying the military is full of extremists, and you have a narrative on the right saying the military has gone woke, right? That both sides are saying the military is just kind of going in a direction that, of course, departs from its core mission, right? Preserving, protecting, defending. What is going on with the military? We have to worry about wokeism, extremism. And we know one thing, they're having difficulty recruiting Americans to serve.
Yeah. Look, we got the greatest military in the world, and I believe in history, and it's because of our young men and women who serve in uniform. And they're not extremists, they're patriots. And it's completely unfair to kind of characterize any of them like that. Now look, as Secretary of the Army in 2018, we would always, as a recruiting process, make sure that we scrubbed people out of the system who came in with some of those beliefs. And every year it was a handful or so. So it wasn't many. And we took a lot of due diligence to kind of get that out of our system. Because look, at the end of the day, we reflect American society, and we should reflect American society. So we bring in 100,000 kids a year into the military from all parts of the country, different cultures, different mindsets, different values, and we try and bring them into one and teach them that, duty first, mission to country, oath of office, all those important things. But we do get people who bring in views that are incompatible with military service. They're incompatible with the military, and we get them out quickly. But you're talking like handfuls. So I think that characterization is completely wrong, and we should just dismiss it. I think Secretary Austin said something the same. It's completely unfair. Look, what I want to see from the Pentagon, what I focused on during my tenure as both Secretary of the Army and Secretary of Defense, is a focus on readiness and warfighting and defending the country, and that's what we need to focus on. Not some of the other things that are being talked about these days that I hear coming out of the Pentagon at times. Let's focus on warfighting, preparing, defending the country, those things that are most critical to America's security.
Well, mention focus on warfighting. I got two more questions, and we'll go to the audience. Taiwan.
Right.
We had Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, visit Taiwan this summer. The Chinese did not like that.
Yeah.
They responded with military aggression to, the Speaker of the House taking a delegation into Taiwan. You worked this issue for years, highlighted it in terms of being a flashpoint, in terms of you thinking about China. President Biden, on at least 4 occasions, has suggested that the United States will defend Taiwan. And each occasion, his staff, which the press refers to as the White House, says, no, our policy of strategic ambiguity, which is we're not going to let anybody know exactly what we will or will not do to support Taiwan. Secretary Esper, is strategic ambiguity strategically beneficial for us or the Chinese right now? And what should we be doing vis-a-vis Taiwan?
So I'm going to answer your question, but first I want to talk about this because it's important with regard to how I wrote the book. So for those of you who are thinking about getting the book or as you read it, it's a memoir that's, of course, mostly retrospective, but I also try to speak prospectively in key parts. So as you read through there, you'll come across a chapter on the withdrawal of troops from Germany, where I talk about the need to have more forces deployed to the east, that we can't trust Putin, so forth and so on. I talk about my concerns about the all-volunteer military, and I have an op-ed today that's out, and it looks like the Army is going to miss their marks on the all-volunteer force. So I try to be prospective in terms of the things I talk about. In the chapter on China, I talk about Taiwan and strategic ambiguity in our policy. And the bottom line that I've been saying now is I think the one China policy has run its course. It's no longer useful in its current mode. I think strategic ambiguity has run its course. And I give President Biden credit for 4 times now saying that we would come to the assistance of this small, robust democracy that sits 100 miles off the coast of mainland China and is being bullied by the Chinese Communist Party. We should support and defend them. And I was in Taiwan meeting with their leadership, President Tsai, just a couple weeks before Speaker Pelosi traveled. Speaker Pelosi was absolutely right to travel. We should not have the travel plans of American officials dictated by the Chinese Communist Party. And so for all those reasons, look, I think we need to have this national discussion about strategic ambiguity. It has run its course. The Congress, I think, is leading the White House on this. Maybe not Joe Biden, but the White House. And I think the administration, it's more dangerous, I think, at this point in time to be ambiguous than not. The Chinese certainly are not. They've violated the one China policy. They have undermined so much of that architecture that has been built up over 50 years now of our relationship with Taiwan and China. So we need to respond. We need to be on the initiative, not responding to the Chinese. And I feel too much these days, we, the administration, maybe not Biden, but we are reacting to the Chinese instead of driving it.
Well, let's go one example of self-deterrence to another. Last headline question before we go to the audience. Ukraine. Russia, of course, invaded in February. Many people felt that Ukraine couldn't withstand that invasion. They have. Not only that, in recent weeks, the Ukrainians have taken back territory that the Russians took after the invasion in February of 2022. Now the discussion is Vladimir Putin, because he's left with no choice, may use tactical nuclear weapons to counter Ukrainian advances. And of course, we have to be careful and maybe even cut out the Ukrainians from their objectives in order to give Putin a win so he won't use nuclear weapons. I've slightly editorialized my view on this. I meant to ask you a question. What do you think of that, Dr. Esper?
What would Reagan do? President Reagan would help the Ukrainian people. I mean, they've been courageous and bold and tenacious, and they're fighting for their lives, their country, their culture, and I think they deserve all of our support. They're on the front lines of this great power competition that's pitting the world's autocracies, namely Russia and China, against the world's democracies. And I think we're in a good spot now with the West. I think most countries in the West, to include extending into Japan and Australia, have done the right thing. We could talk about Germany a little bit, but I do think the administration at times has been behind the ball. They said the wrong things. Remember early on, Biden was saying whether it's a minor incursion versus a major incursion, and then there was, why not send this versus that weapon system? And then we were concerned about, how would Putin react if Sweden and Finland joined the alliance, and they're just a couple votes away. We're exercising more self-deterrence against Putin than need be. We're too concerned about this or that, and I think what we should do is, again, follow our principles, do what Ronald Reagan would do, support the Ukrainian people, give them the arms they need, the material they need, and allow them to beat the Russians and win. And they can win. And I think if they can, it's going to be a big blow to Putin personally and to this movement, this growing collaboration, if not partnership, if not alliance, between Beijing and Moscow that we need to be concerned about in this century, or else it's not going to bode well for the Western democracy.
All right, questions from the audience for Secretary Mark Esper. Let's go over here, this gentleman right here in the front. Well, I guess here, that works too.
Last month, there's been a number of articles in the magazines, newspapers, stating that China now has the most technologically powerful and the largest navy in the world. Do you agree with that? And what must be done to stop them?
So the answer is yes and no. I have a chapter on this in my book. China now does have the largest navy in the world. but it's not the most technologically advanced. We still have the most technologically advanced Navy in the world. We have 11 aircraft carriers. They have 3. Our advanced submarines, our destroyers are far more capable than theirs. But look, quantity, we call it capacity in the military, is important. If we're going to continue to control the sea lanes, protect freedom of navigation, protect the free flow of commerce through the South China Sea, then we have to have a Navy big enough to defend those waters and to do it without running our Navy into the ground. So our Navy needs to grow much, much larger. You know, at the end of my tenure, I proposed Battle Force 2045, which was a combination of manned and unmanned ships. It would take the current count of Navy ships, which is around 290, and get it above 500, because I think that's what we need. But we're simply not moving out, and I talk about this in great detail. We need to control the seas, and we need a Navy that's capable of doing that. And through a combination of, you know, the Navy not taking the initiative, between Congress, the White House, industry, and so forth, we can't seem to get out of our own way and build the Navy we need to deal with the Chinese in the future.
Another question. Let's go. Woman over here. Oh, gentleman over here. Okay?
Yeah. Good evening, sir. Throughout the book, you talk about how it's a national security issue for us to have the most diverse, equitable, and inclusive all-volunteer force. And I'm curious, when you got to the OSD level, what particular policies you may have considered for specifically our science and technology laboratories, where in the STEM fields, maybe this is probably the most acute for us to pursue DEI initiatives.
Yeah, look, I think diversity and inclusion is important in the sense of the morale and readiness of the force. I think every service member who joins as enlisted or becomes an NCO or an officer has to know that they're going to be judged based on their merits and their character, not based on the character of their skin or their sexual orientation or their religion. So that's how I put the issue of diversity and inclusion in the context of morale and readiness of the force and what it means for our service members. Look, the military may be the most diverse organization in the United States government. I think the last count, I talk about this in my book, by the way, 42% of serving members are a minority. In the Army alone, you know, the percent of African Americans far exceeds that in the population. So it's a very diverse force, and I've been privileged to serve in it. So when I was Secretary of Defense, this was another in the complicated times, right? I put forward 3 major initiatives to build that out. And by the way, diversity is not just for, you know, people you know, based on your ethnicity or whatnot, but give women more opportunities to serve as well, because but it has to be standards based and based on merit. And so the initiatives I had addressed all those in terms of for example, getting rid of photos in promotion boards. There's no reason for somebody to see your photo on a promotion board, because if you look at a photo, it automatically triggers a response. Are they good looking or bad looking? Are they have dark hair or blonde hair? You know, do they have a crew cut? You know, I used to wear my hair, you know, really you know, all those things signal things, and what you want to do is judge them based on their performance, not on how they look. And so it was simple things like that that we were doing to build diversity and inclusion, but it has to have a purpose. It just can't be for the sake of it. And that's kind of how I approached it, and I think that's how most service members want to be judged as well. I'll give you a quick example. Again, I talk about this in my book. As Secretary of the Army, we adopted a new combat fitness test. And the combat fitness test included six different elements that were very tough and demanding. It was the toughest, and it's still, by the way, out there, but we had lawmakers on Capitol Hill that wanted to water it down because they thought enough women couldn't pass the test. And the Army now recently is starting to succumb to that. Thank goodness we had American women who said, no, we want to be judged the same as the men. We can meet their standard. And I met woman after woman across the Army as I would travel around that could meet the standard. And so I think we send wrong messages as well when we water down standards to accommodate an aim with no purpose. And so I gave our women a lot of credit for standing up and defending the combat fitness test that we designed. I think it's going to be very important for them and very important for the readiness of our military.
Last question from the audience for Secretary Esper. Let's go to
last. We can go on.
Lady in the back over there.
So you had 4 no's. Did you have any yeses for a man who chose you for that position to work with him?
Any what?
Any yeses?
Meaning you have 4 no's for what you wouldn't do, but do you have any yeses for President Trump?
Look, I know folks don't like to hear it because it seems so binary to too many people that it's either black or white. You either love Trump and everything he did was great, or you hate Trump, and that's not the case. Look, if you're a Republican like I am, you look back over his 4 years, there are things that he accomplished that were good, right? You may not like them, maybe other people here don't like them, but you know, we had lower taxes, we had deregulation, we put a lot of money into to rebuild the military. There were a lot of things. I believe in border security. I think building the border wall was the right thing to do. Now, I also believe we need new immigration laws. And I'm a grandson of an immigrant, so I believe in immigration. But there's a lot of good things that I think as administration, his policy, he did as administration did, that I was very supportive on, that I absolutely said yes to. But there are a lot of things that, as I've recounted in the book, that I've said no to as well. And that's kind of my advice for Republicans as they look ahead. I describe myself as a Reagan Republican, and I say, look, if you want policies, traditional conservative policies, lower taxes, deregulation, conservative judges, strong military, you know, we were talking about this beforehand, border security, then you can get that there are candidates out there that will deliver that without the baggage and coarseness and self-centeredness that Donald Trump brings. And that's the leaders we need to look to in the future. And that's who we need to celebrate. We need to find those leaders and elevate them, because we need somebody that can bring the country together. You know, as I go on the road, we talk about issues in the country, and I talk about, people ask me, what's the greatest threat facing the country these days? And everybody expects me to say China. And China is indeed the greatest external threat we face. But in my mind, the greatest threat we face is extreme partisanship in this country. And it's coming from both sides. And it's bad, and it's tearing us apart. It's burning down our institutions, and it's really putting Americans against Americans. And we need to find that leader that will bring us up. And I tell folks, look, we've been here before, right? Many of us are old enough to remember the 70s. We had long gas lines then. We had high inflation, high interest rates back then. We had the tragic killing of, you know, Israeli athletes in Munich. We had the Iran hostage crisis. We had Desert One. A lot of bad things happened, right? And we're feeling down on ourselves. Jimmy Carter was telling us we don't have enough energy, so put sweaters on in the winter. And then Ronald Reagan came along. And he offered a new vision. He told us about the shining city on the hill, and he lifted us up and brought this country together. And we had a wonderful, at least I thought, you know, the country took off, and we found that new renaissance in our country. So I think that next great American leader is there. I think we need to move on in both parties to a next generation of leaders. And I think it'll be that person that will bring us back together and get us to where we need to be as the great country that we are.
Secretary Mark Esper, thank you for joining us this evening. Congratulations on your work.